Today we're doing a Christian biography of Muhammad. So the immediate question is, well, why would a Christian do a video about the life of Muhammad? And there's a few reasons. The first of which is that Christians should be thinking about everything. And Muhammad is one of the most important characters in human history, whether you like him or not. The second is that I just don't think there's much material out there that really does justice to the source material as far as Muhammad's life goes. So on the one hand, you have a lot of non-Muslim sources, which are just kind of like relentlessly critical, and all they're doing is looking for all the worst elements of Muhammad's life. On the other hand, I find a lot of the Muslim sources are just too tidy. They clean things up too easily, and when you actually dig into the source materials, it's very interesting. There's lots of very interesting things to look at that you miss when you're only taking it from a sort of hyper-skeptical perspective, or you're looking at it from a sort of conservative or liberal Muslim perspective. So I want to do an honest look at Muhammad's life. So the sources I am mostly consulting for this, which I've read firsthand myself, are going to be first Sirat Rasul Allah by Ibn Ishaq, which, like it or not, it is the earliest biography of Muhammad. It's preserved in two different ways, through a guy called Ibn Hisham, and it's preserved by Al-Tabari. This is written about 100 years after Muhammad, and the first manuscript is about 200 years after Muhammad. And then I'm also relying on the history of Al-Tabari as well, although Al-Tabari relies a lot on Ibn Ishaq. And even though it's not always considered the most reliable thing by conservative Muslim scholars, the fact is that a lot of people that conservative Muslim scholars do rely on, like Ibn Kathir, for example, relies pretty extensively on Ibn Ishaq on his biographies of Muhammad himself, because the Hadith or the Qur'an don't provide a narrative structure of Muhammad's life, and you have to look at earlier biographies or later biographies in order to do that. So I've relied on Ibn Ishaq and Al-Tabari a lot, and then wherever I can, I've gone to the Sitta Hadith, which is the Hadith considered most reliable by Sunni Muslims. Shia Muslims disagree on a lot of that, and I'll try and give the Shia perspective whenever I can throughout this as well. One last caveat before we get in, that I see this as the first of a few videos on Islamic history in general, so there may be things I'm emphasizing in here because I'm going to revisit them later because they're going to have impacts on history later. So some people may feel like I'm being too easy on Muhammad. Some people may feel like I'm being too hard on Muhammad. There's obviously lots more I could say, in either good or bad, and I would encourage you to read the sources yourselves, investigate this yourselves, and come to your own conclusions on this. Don't just take my word for it. Also, in this video, I am not representing Muhammad visually. That's not because I believe I'm not allowed to do it. It's just because I don't want to unnecessarily offend my Muslim viewers. I want to have a conversation about substance with this, not simply symbolism. So without further ado, let's get to it. So this whole story starts in Arabia in the year 570. Arabia at this time is at the frontier of the two main empires of the region, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And Arabia is basically the Wild West at this time. It's basically lawless unless you're part of a tribe. And each tribe kind of has their own legal system, has their own god, has their own way of doing things. And if you're part of one of these well-connected tribes, you're in a pretty good position. But if you're not in one of these tribes, then you can be in serious danger. And Arabia is not a good place for you to be. But because of its lawlessness, a lot of people actually ended up finding refuge there away from the empires. So, for example, the Jews at the time, many had fled from the Babylonian exile of Jews and the Roman exile of Jews in AD 70 and were still there 500 years later. Also, a lot of Christian groups that didn't fit in during the Byzantine Empire, say, Arian Christians or particular brands of heretics, would seek refuge in somewhere like Arabia, where the watchful eye of the Byzantine Church couldn't get you, basically. So Mecca, according to the Islamic sources, is called the mother of settlements, and that is because it's the central place of this Arab polytheism. So Allah is the supreme God, and then he has daughters and associates like Alat and Manat, and basically people will come to the Kaaba in Mecca for something called the Hajj, where they bring sacrificial animals and they have a pilgrimage every year. And this has made Mecca the most important religious city in Arabia. And the claim is this started with Abraham and Ishmael, and then as a monotheistic exercise, and then got kind of corrupted over time according to the Islamic sources. In this area, a man named Muhammad was born, and he was born in the year 570 in something called the Year of the Elephant. And the story goes that one of the Quraysh polytheists went to Yemen, which was under the influence of Ethiopia, urinated on a church, and then the polytheists burned the church down, and the king of Ethiopia sent an army to Mecca in revenge, led by an elephant named Mahmud. But before the army reached Mecca, a flock of birds came down and rained stones on the army, killing the elephant and driving it back. Muhammad was born that year, but his father died while his mother was pregnant, and his mother died 6 months after the young Muhammad was born, meaning that he was raised as an orphan by his kindly uncle Abu Talib. When Muhammad was a boy, Abu Talib took him on a trade journey up to Syria, and the Muslim sources say there was a Christian monk in a cage who spotted the young Muhammad and says, "Bring that boy to me. Take off his shirt." And he looked at Muhammad's back, and on Muhammad's back there was a kind of lump of flesh surrounded by moles on every side. And this Christian monk said, "This is the seal of the prophets, and it's evidence that God has chosen this boy to be a prophet to his people." So Muhammad went back with Abu Talib and lived in Mecca, according to the Muslim accounts, as a honest and upright man who was already monotheist before Islam started. So he believed in Allah, the supreme God, but he didn't believe in any of the other gods with him. A woman called Khadija, who is a wealthy widow, very successful, has a trading business, hears about Muhammad, and she hires him to escort one of her trade caravans up to Syria. So he goes on this journey with her camels and does a great job. And when he gets back, Khadija is so impressed by him that she marries him. And one of the first things she does is she gives him a slave named Zayd. And Muhammad loves Zayd like he loves his own son. But one day, his family, who had sold him into slavery because they couldn't afford to keep him, come and they find Zayd living with Muhammad. And Zayd says that, "No, I don't want to go back with you. There's something special about this man. I want to stay with him." At which time Muhammad says, "Tell you what, I'm going to free Zayd and adopt him as my own son." At that point, Muhammad's happy, Zayd is happy, and Zayd's family is happy as well, and they go back to their own tribe and leave Zayd with Muhammad. Muhammad and Khadija also have another son named Qasim, and then they have 4 daughters, Ruqayya, Zainab, Fatima, and Kulfa. Now this comes to the first dissension between the Sunni and Shia accounts we have of this. So Sunni Muslims believe all 4 of these girls are the daughters of Muhammad and Khadija. Shia believe that Fatima is Muhammad and Khadija's only daughter, and the other girls come from Khadija's previous marriage. I'm not going to say what I think about that because it's actually irrelevant for the rest of the biography. Only one of these daughters will have children anyway, so there's not like multiple lines, so it becomes a moot point. Where the story goes, in 610, Muhammad is praying in a cave. And as he's praying in the cave, seeking God's guidance, a shining entity appears to him and says, "Recite." And he says, "I don't know how." Then the entity squeezes him. He can't breathe, releases him and says, "Recite." He says, "I don't know how." and then squeezes him a third time. It's a recite. Then Muhammad starts to recite Surah Alaq, the 96th surah of the Qur'an. And what it's telling him to do is stand up to Abu Jahl, the chief of the Quraysh tribe that Muhammad is a part of. So Muhammad is initially freaked out by this encounter. And he goes back to Khadija and he says, cover me because I've been possessed by the spirit of a jinn or a poet. But Khadija calms him down and explains to him that that's not what's going on. She calls her Christian uncle Waraka, and they sit down with Muhammad and explain to him that everything the angel is saying is true, and clearly he has been chosen as a prophet. So for the next few years, he starts teaching everyone around him what he is getting from these revelations. And some of the key content of these revelations is, first, that polytheism is wrong. Surah An-Najm says, "These idols are mere names that you and your forefathers have made up, a practice Allah has never authorized. They follow nothing but inherited assumptions, and whatever their souls desire, although true guidance has already come to them from their Lord." So there's not lots of gods. Allah is the only God. So Allah was not a name invented by Muhammad. It was a name of God already used by the Quraysh. It was already used by Christians in Arabia as well. The word Allah is the Arabic word for the God. People will say lots of different things about that, but it seems pretty clear that that word pre-existed. Along with that, polytheistic Arabia had all these competing legal codes and justice systems depending on how well connected you were, and Islam preached a universal moral code. So Surah Al-Hujurat says, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you into people and tribes so you may know one another. Surely the most noble among you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous among you. Allah is truly all-knowing, all-aware." So the idea is that everyone is accountable to God, and everyone should be equal under the law. It doesn't matter if you're a Quraysh or a non-Quraysh, if you're a slave or free. Everyone is created by God and has rights and obligations to God, no matter how well connected you are. Another thing that the Quran is preaching against is female infanticide. So in Surah An-Nahl it says, "And they attribute angels as daughters to Allah. Glory be to Him, the opposite of what they desire for themselves. Whenever one of them is given the good news of a baby girl, his face grows gloomy as he suppresses his rage. He hides himself from the people because of the bad news he has received. Should he keep her in disgrace or bury her alive in the ground? Evil indeed is their judgment." So we don't know how widespread this practice was, but evidently there is a practice among the pre-Muslim Arabs of burying a baby girl alive so they don't have to pay for her upbringing. And people will dispute this, but it doesn't really make sense for the Quran to be arguing about this unless there's some truth to the real practice going on. It says having a baby girl is good news, burying her alive is evil. We also see a huge emphasis on care for poor and orphans, as Muhammad himself was an orphan. This completely makes sense with his backstory. It says, "But when he tests them by limiting their provision, they protest. My Lord has undeservedly humiliated me. Absolutely not. In fact, you are not even gracious to the orphan, nor do you urge one another to feed the poor, and you would devour others' inheritance greedily." And also, as in connection with this, it bans interest. So Surah Al-Baqarah says, "Allah has permitted trade and has forbidden interest. So whoever has received an admonition from his Lord and desists may have what is past, and is a fair rest with the law. But whoever returns in dealing interest or usury, those are the companions of the fire and will abide eternally therein." So interest at the time was this widespread exploitation of the poor that is called evil by the Quran. Now, one of the two biggest areas people like to talk about in regards to Islam's transformation of Arabia is women's rights and slavery. So did Islam make things better or worse for women? And that probably depends on who you are. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, a successful tribal woman like Khadija would have actually had a high station, right? She owned a business, she inherited wealth, whereas if you were like a slave woman, your life was terrible. And what Islam is going to do is going to make someone like Khadija's life a little less luxurious. She's going to have to wear a hijab, she's going to have to kind of cover up, and she's going to need a guardian and things like that for the most part. But then somebody who's a slave woman, Islam made their rights, a lot better and actually viewed them as human beings. And in slavery in general, people want to see Islam as something that abolished slavery. And while it's not true that Islam abolished slavery, certainly not in Muhammad's lifetime, Muhammad himself owned slaves. But generally, Islam encourages releasing slaves. It encourages seeing them as human beings and treating them humanely and being concerned for their well-being. You can certainly say that slavery under Islam got better than what it was before. So Muhammad starts teaching all this to a close circle of people all around him. His wife Khadija immediately believes him. His daughters immediately believe him. Ali, his cousin, and who's like a brother to him because they both grew up with Abu Talib as the father figure, he believes as well. And Zayd, his adopted son, believes in Islam. And then a wealthy, successful merchant named Abu Bakr believes him. A guy called Uthman, who's a very, very successful, wealthy merchant, believes him. He also receives a lot of opposition because what he's saying is dangerous to the Quraysh way of life. I mean, this city of Mecca depends on the trade that polytheism brings. So Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan, two tribal chiefs, oppose him rigorously, but they don't hurt him because he has an uncle called Abu Talib, who, while he never converts to Islam according to Sunnis, he does according to Shias, he basically gives Muhammad protection. Abu Sufyan's daughter actually converts to Islam and marries a Muslim man. In the year 613, Uthman marries Muhammad's daughter Ruqayya. But in that year, the Muslims are suffering a lot. The ideas are unpopular, and while Muhammad can't be persecuted because of his position, the Muslims who are poor, the Muslims who are slaves, the Muslims without the proper connections are suffering. One woman is killed. Somebody throws sheep intestines over Muhammad. It's just a difficult situation to be Muslim in Mecca at this time. So the way that Ibn Ishaq puts it is that when the Apostle of Allah saw the distress which his companions suffered, while he himself enjoyed comparative immunity under the protection of Allah and his uncle Abu Talib, and that he was unable to save them, he said, "If you were to go to the country of the Abyssinians, you would do well. There is a king there under whom no one is persecuted. It is a country of truth where you can remain until Allah grants you deliverance from the miseries of the present." So the companions of the Apostle of Allah immigrated for fear of temptation, flying for refuge. And those who immigrated were 83 in number. Among them was Abdullah, one of the 4 inquirers. Also, Uthman joins them as well. Uthman leaves everything. He leaves his business behind and then immediately becomes successful in Abyssinia as a businessman as well. Everything Uthman touches turns to gold. He's just good at networking. In that year, Muhammad's son Abdullah dies as well. In the year 616, there's a guy called Omar, who is the firebrand of the Quraysh. He's very zealous, has a very hot temper, and he is so angry by what's going on that he vows that he himself is going to kill Muhammad. So he's about to kill Muhammad, and he goes to his sister's house, who has become Muslim, and hears her reciting the Qur'an. And immediately he's like, well, what is that? That's amazing. So then she takes him to Muhammad, and he converts Omar to Islam. And then immediately Omar goes to the Kaaba, where the Muslims have not been allowed to pray, puts his sword down next to him, and says, all right, if anybody wants to stop me from praying, they'll have to deal with my sword. And this gives the Muslims in Mecca more courage. But in the year 619, Muhammad's protection dies. Abu Talib and his beloved wife Khadija die in the same year. So this whole time, as tribes would come to Mecca for the pilgrimage, Muhammad would stand by the wells as they watered their camels, and he'd strike up conversations with them. He'd say, it doesn't make sense that there's all these gods. Clearly there's only one God, and that's who we should worship. And by the way, Allah, the one God, has sent me as his prophet to tell you to turn away from your worship of idols and follow the one true God. Most of the tribes ignore him, except for one tribe, the tribe of Yathrib or Medina. According to the historians, having a large Jewish population in Medina basically makes the Arabs of Medina take extra notice when they hear about Muhammad claiming to be a prophet, and they listen to him intensely, and they say, we're willing to convert to Islam. Now, I think it's worth pointing out, up to this point in his life, there's nothing that a Christian can really disagree with in the life of Muhammad. He is a monotheist preaching the oneness of God against polytheists. He is affirming all the prophets that have come before him. He is a one-woman man who is using persuasion, not coercion, to bring people to his way of thinking. And he is suffering persecution patiently, just as Christians are told to suffer persecution patiently. By all accounts, there's nothing for us to disagree with at this point. And this moment here really begins the path where Muhammad would really diverge from New Testament Christianity. After the Ansar, the people of Medina, go back and consult, a new revelation comes to Muhammad, and he goes to them and demands that if they're going to receive him as a prophet, they also have to vow to fight for him and to follow him as a political leader, not just as a religious figure. The leaders of Medina agree to this. In 622, Muhammad and Abu Bakr leave Mecca and go to Medina, where he assumes political and military and religious authority. And this is a very significant period of time because this is where the Islamic calendar starts. You will see the Muslims measure time not by AD, but after Hijrah. Christians see time as BC and AD, before Christ, and AD meaning the year of our Lord, so everything since Jesus measured by his birth, whereas Muslims measure time being after Hijrah, the time when Muhammad ascended to political power and the Muslim state was born. So in Sahih Muslim, Muhammad says, "Whoso obeys me, obeys God, and who disobeys me, disobeys God. Whoso obeys my commander, obeys me, and whoso disobeys my commander, disobeys me." Medina is now full of Jewish tribes, the Ansar, the native Arab residents of Medina, and the Muhajirun, the Muslims who have immigrated from Mecca to Medina. And in order to manage the situation, Muhammad puts together something called the Charter of Medina. So the charter ends with, "And the Jews of Banu Auf shall be considered one community along with the believers, for the Jews their religion, for the Muslims theirs, to be one client or patron, but whoever does wrong or commits treachery brings evil only on himself and his household." So there's this agreement made. The Jews can continue living as Jews, the Muslims will live as Muslims, and they will all protect each other and make sure that the treaty is enforced. Everyone is only punished for their individual crimes, not punished as a group. This charter does create religious tolerance. It does also make Muhammad the complete judge and arbiter of all matters in Medina as well. After the death of Khadijah, a woman comes to Muhammad and suggests that he remarry, and she asks him, what do you want? Do you want to marry a widow, or do you want to marry someone who's never been married before? So Muhammad actually marries two women at this point. He marries Sauda, who is a widow, and Aisha, who has never been married before. Now, the Sahih Hadith in Sunni Islam say that Aisha was 9 years old when Muhammad married her. And this is obviously a controversial topic. It's in the sources. I don't think it's fair to single Muhammad out for marrying a young girl. It seems to be the sort of common cultural practice. So do with that what you will. He also marries Omar's daughter, Hafsa. He also marries Abu Sufyan's daughter. Now, Habiba went to Abyssinia with her husband, but while she was there, her husband converted to Christianity. She divorced him, he died, and then Muhammad marries her as well. So during his time in Medina, Muhammad is married to a total of 11 total women. Probably the most controversial of these is his marriage to Zainab bint Jahsh, who is the ex-wife of his adopted son. When Muhammad marries Zainab, Surah Al-Azhab comes down, commanding the marriage and also abolishing calling your adopted sons by your last name, and basically shifting the Islamic mindset from adoption to guardianship of people who have lost their parents. And Zayd goes back to his old last name and is no longer Zayd bin Muhammad. So during this time, I think it's worth noting that polygamy, wherever it's practiced, is a messy affair, even in the life of Muhammad. So my favorite hadith I've read about this, to kind of give you an idea of how much drama polygamy can lead to, is in Sahih al-Bukhari. It says, the wives of Allah's messenger were in two groups. One group consisted of Aisha, Hafsa, Safiya, and Sauda, and the other group consisted of Salama and the other wives of Allah's messenger. The Muslims knew that Allah's messenger loved Aisha, that if any of them had a gift or wished to give to Allah's messenger, he would delay it till Allah's messenger had come to Aisha's home, and then he would send his gift to Allah's messenger in her home. The group of Salama discussed the matter together and decided that Salama should request Allah's messenger to tell the people to send their gifts to him in whatever wife's house he was. Salama told Allah's messenger of what they had said, but he did not reply. They then asked Salama about it. She said, he did not say anything to me. They asked her to talk to him again. She talked to him again when she met him on her day, but he gave no reply. When they asked her, she replied he had given no reply. They said to her, talk to him till he gives you a reply. When it was her turn, she talked to him again. He then said to her, do not hurt me regarding Aisha, as the divine inspirations do not come to me on any of the beds except that of Aisha. On that, Salama said, I repent to Allah for hurting you. Then the group of Salama called Fatima, the daughter of Allah's messenger, and sent her to Allah's messenger to say to him, your wives request to treat them and the daughter of Abu Bakr on equal terms. Then Fatima conveyed the message to him. The Prophet said, O my daughter, don't you love who I love? She replied in the affirmative and returned and told of the situation. They requested her to go to him again and she refused. They then sent Zainab bint Jahsh, who went to him and used harsh words saying, your wives request you to treat them and the daughter of Qahafa on equal terms. On that she raised her voice and abused Aisha to her face, so much that Allah's messenger looked at Aisha to see whether she would retort. Aisha started replying to Zainab till she silenced her. The Prophet then looked at Aisha and said, she really is Abu Bakr's daughter. What they're basically complaining about here is that Aisha is the one getting the cool stuff because everybody knows that Aisha is Muhammad's favorite living wife. Now, I think if you look at the sources, it's clear that Aisha is Muhammad's favorite wife, at least the one who is living. So Khadija is his most beloved, the one that was there from the beginning, the one that gave him his daughters. But out of the ones that were alive in Medina, he enjoyed spending time with Aisha the most. 2 years after leaving Mecca, the Muslims start raiding the Meccan trade caravans. A lot of them were wealthy, they were now all poor because they had left everything behind, so they started raiding the Quraysh trade caravans. This caused the Quraysh to send a military expedition to try and crush the Muslim presence in Medina, and the Muslims went out to meet them and fought the Battle of Badr, where the Muslims with less equipment and inferior numbers managed to overpower the Meccan forces and drive them back. After returning from the Battle of Badr, there was a conflict between Muhammad and one of the Jewish tribes living in Medina. According to Al-Tabari, after the Messenger of God killed many polytheists of the Quraysh at Badr, the Jews were envious and behaved badly towards him, saying, had he met us, he would have had a battle which would have been unlike a battle with anyone else. They also infringed the contract in various ways. According to Al-Zuri, Urwa, Gabriel brought the following verse down to the Messenger of God. And if thou fearest treachery from any folk, then throw back to them their treaty fairly. As when Gabriel had finished delivering this verse, the Messenger of God said, I fear the Banu Qunayna. Urwa says, it was on the basis of this verse that the Messenger of God advanced upon them. According to Al-Waqidi, Muhammad Salih al-Sim al-Ma'ar Qatada, the Messenger of God besieged them for 15 days and prevented any of them from getting out. They surrendered at the discretion of the Messenger of God. They were fettered and he wanted to kill them, but Abdullah ibn Ubay spoke to him on their behalf. So instead of them dying, a guy steps in and basically says, they've been my allies, they've taken care of me, I don't want them to die. And he arranges for their exile and they're escorted out of Medina. In this year, Muhammad's daughter Fatima is married to his cousin Ali, and his daughter Ruqayya, who is married to Uthman, dies. After the mourning period, Uthman marries Muhammad's other daughter, Kulthum. Then after this, the Quraysh come to fight the Muslims again, and this time they are accompanied by a guy called Khalid ibn Walid, who is an exceptional fighter, an exceptional general, and the Muslims are defeated in the Battle of Uhud, partly because the archers, who were supposed to sort of maintain their position, stopped firing on the retreating Quraysh and tried to get the treasure instead, and the Quraysh cavalry turned around and routed the Muslim forces. However, the Muslims were not defeated decisively. They went back to Medina, Muhammad having lost his 2 front teeth, but no more serious injuries than that. Then, Al-Tabari says, the Banu Nadir and the Banu Amin were joined by a treaty and compact, and when the Messenger of God came to them to ask for their help in payment of the blood money of those 2 men, they said, yes, Abu al-Qasim, we will give you the help which you want and which you have asked from us. They then spoke privately with one another and said, you will never find this man in such a situation again. The Messenger of God was sitting by the well of one of their houses, and they said, who will go on the roof of this house and drop a stone on him and kill him, and so relieve us of him? Amr bin Ka'b, who was one of them, came forward to do this and said, I am your man. Then he went up to the roof to drop a stone on him as arranged. The Messenger of God was with a number of his companions, including Abu Bakr, Omar, and Ali, and news of what the people intended came to him from heaven. So the idea is there's an assassination plot, and the angel Gabriel, like the last time, warns him that this Jewish tribe is up to something, and then he leads a military expedition against them. This time they take their possessions, but they exile them and allow them to leave Medina alive. The year after this, the Meccans come all the way to Medina to try and stamp out the Muslims for good, but the Muslims, with the help of a guy called Salman the Persian, who kind of basically tried every single religion there was before finding Muhammad and becoming Muslim, teach them how to dig a trench, and they successfully repel the Meccan attack. Then, according to Sahih al-Bukhari, when Allah's messenger returned one day from the Battle of the Trench, he put down his arms and took a bath. Then Gabriel, whose head was covered with dust, came to him saying, you have put down your arms. By Allah, I have not put down my arms yet. Allah's messenger said, where to go now? Gabriel said, this way, pointing towards the tribe of the Banu Qurayza. So Allah's messenger went out towards them. After the Battle of the Trench, the Qur'an basically makes the case that the Banu Qurayza were cooperating with the Quraysh against the Muslims, and Gabriel told Muhammad to go and attack them as well. So they surround them, they surrender, and according to Sahih al-Bukhari, it says, Bani an-Nadir and Bani Qurayza fought against the Prophet, violating their peace treaty. So the Prophet exiled the Bani an-Nadir and allowed the Bani Qurayza to remain in their places in Medina, taking nothing from them until they fought against the Prophet again. So then, he killed their men and distributed their women, children, and property among the Muslims, but some of them came to the Prophet, and he granted them safety, and they embraced Islam. He exiled all the Jews from Medina. They were the Jews of the Bani Kaynuna, the tribe of Abdullah bin Salam, and the Jews of the Bani Haritha, and all the other Jews of Medina. The tribes were exiled, and there is some evidence that there were some Jews in Medina after this point, but this time Medina becomes basically entirely Muslim, and the Jews are gone from Medina. After consolidating his power in Medina and defeating the Meccans at the Battle of the Trench, Muhammad gets all the Muslims of Medina to march to Mecca, not in military uniform, but wearing the attire of pilgrims going to the Hajj. The Quraysh are alarmed by this and don't trust the Muslims, don't want them to enter the city and do the Hajj. So the Muslims send Uthman in to negotiate a treaty with them. He creates something called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah basically creates peace between the Muslims of Medina and the Quraysh and allows them to basically build their own tribal confederation across the Arabian Peninsula, allowing them to compete on friendly terms for the control of Arabia. Right after this, Khalid ibn Walid converts to Islam as well, and this frees Muhammad to send expeditions and missionaries and raids all across Arabia, building a huge confederation of Muslims across the country. But at this time, there is an incident which is difficult. So Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, is left behind as one of the camps moves on, as she's looking for her necklace. And a young warrior named Safwan brings her back to the camp. And everybody looks at the two of them riding together and starts a rumor that Aisha had committed adultery with Safwan. Muhammad does not know what to do in this circumstance. He does not know who to believe. So Aisha goes back to her parents' house, and Sahih al-Bukhari describes it this way. That night I kept on weeping and could not sleep until morning. In the morning, Allah's Messenger called Ali bin Abu Talib and Osama bin Zayd when he saw the divine inspiration delayed, to consult them about divorcing his wife. Osama bin Zayd said what he knew of the good reputation of his wives and added, O Allah's Messenger, keep your wife, for by Allah we know nothing about her but good. Ali bin Abu Talib said, O Allah's Messenger, Allah has not imposed restriction on you, and there are many women other than she. Yet you may ask the woman servant who will tell you the truth. On that, Allah's Messenger called Bariya and said, O Bariya, did you ever see anything which roused your suspicions about her? Bariya said, No, by Allah who has sent you with the truth, I've never seen anything faulty except that she is a girl of immature age who sometimes sleeps and leaves the dough for the goats to eat. At this point, one of Muhammad's companions, Osama, says, No, she's a good woman, don't divorce her. Ali's advice is a little more neutral than that. Doesn't tell Muhammad to divorce her, but he says there's other women out there, don't concern yourself over this matter. He certainly doesn't stick up for her in overt terms, and this may be the beginning of the rift between Ali and Aisha, which will certainly play out later in Islamic history. After listening to this advice, Muhammad actually receives a surah of the Qur'an, which says, Indeed, those who came up with that outrageous slander are a group of you. Do not think this is bad for you, rather it is good for you. They will be punished, each according to their share of the sin. As for their mastermind, he will suffer a tremendous punishment. If only the believing men and women had thought well of one another when you heard this rumor and said this is clearly an outrageous slander. Why did they not produce 4 witnesses? Now, since they have failed to produce witnesses, they are truly liars in the sight of Allah. This surah of the Quran comes vindicating Aisha and silencing all of her critics. After this, Muhammad sets out an expedition to Khyber, which many of the Jews who fled Medina had settled in. So this was sort of a collection of fortresses. It was very wealthy, and Muhammad defeats the Jews living there, and Ali is the champion of this battle. He takes Muhammad's standard, and this actually marks the beginning of the end for Muhammad. So after defeating the Jewish population there, a Jewish woman offers to throw a conciliatory feast. This account is in all of the Sahih Hadith, all of the Sirat literature, but I like the way Sunan Abu Dawud puts it. It says, a Jewish presented Muhammad at Khyber a roasted sheep which she had poisoned. The Apostle of Allah ate of it, and the people also ate. He then said, Lift your hands from eating, for it is informed me that it is poisoned. Bishr bin al-Bara al-Ansari died, so the Prophet sent for the Jewess and said to her, What motivated you to do the work you've done? She said, If you were a prophet, it would not harm you, but if you were a king, I would rid the people of you. The Apostle of Allah then ordered regarding her, and she was killed. He then said about the pain which he died, I continued to feel the pain from the morsel which I had eaten at Khyber. This is the time when it had cut off my aorta. So Muhammad didn't die at this moment, but he was never quite the same again from a health standpoint, and basically got sicker and sicker from this point on. In 629, Zainab, his daughter, dies, and Muhammad is given the gift of a slave woman called Maria the Copt. He's given 2 sisters actually, but Islamic law did not allow him to take both, so he takes Maria the Copt as his slave. Maria the Copt then conceives and gives birth to a son named Ibrahim, at which point Muhammad says that having a son has freed her, and Maria the Copt became one of Muhammad's wives. Later that year, Muhammad's formerly adopted son Zayd leads a military campaign and fights a battle called the Battle of Mu'tah against the Byzantines. This is the first battle between the Muslims and the Byzantines, because their territories now cross over with each other and they're vying for control of the different tribes. The Muslims see the Byzantines as a threat, the Byzantines see the Muslims as a threat. I wanted to read you, I love the way Al-Tabari describes this because it captures the Muslim battle ethic at this time. The commander, Abdullah bin Rawaha, encouraged the men, saying, "Men, by God, what you loathe is the very thing you came to seek, martyrdom. We do not fight the enemy by number, strength, or multitude. We fight them only by this religion with which God has honored us. Go forward, for it is one of two good things, victory or martyrdom." So you can see why these Muslim warriors were so effective. Very much similar in their ethic to the Vikings. It's victory or Valhalla. And this is a recipe for very ferocious warriors. So during this battle, the Muslims lose against the superior numbers of the Byzantines, but their 3 commanders die. And then Khalid ibn Walid picks up the standard and rescues the rest of the Muslim army from being destroyed and brings them back to Medina. At which Muhammad's reaction is this. He says, "Zayd has died a martyr's death." He prayed forgiveness for him. Then Jafar, that's Ali's brother, took up the banner and attacked the enemy until he died a martyr's death. He testified that he had attained martyrdom and prayed for forgiveness for him. Then Abdullah bin Rawaha, the guy who gave the previous speech, took up the banner and planted his legs firmly until he died a martyr's death. He prayed for forgiveness for him. Then Khalid bin Walid took up the banner. He was not one of the commanders, but he showed himself to be a real commander. Then the messenger of God said, "O God, he is one of thy swords, and thou wilt aid him." From that day on, Khalid was named the Sword of God. And Khalid bin Walid would be put at the head of every Muslim army from this time until the time of Omar. After this, one of the tribes that was affiliated with the Quraysh in Mecca attacked and made war on one of the tribes affiliated with the Muslims. This was seen as a breach of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So Muhammad, in his normal fashion, started telling everybody in Medina to prepare for an expedition. He would not tell them where. And there's clamor, no one knows where they're going. This secrecy was probably an intelligence move so that no one could predict what he was going to do. So everyone was getting ready, and Abu Bakr goes into Aisha's house and says, "Aisha, do you know where we're going?" And she says, "We're going to Mecca." So in the night, the army leaves, and the Meccans go outside, and they see thousands of torches, and they are terrified of what's going to happen to them. This army is big enough to mean their complete destruction. So Abu Sufyan rides out and meets with Ali and asks, "What can I do? How can we escape our fates?" And Ali says, "Well, I don't know, but what you should do is go and be a mediator of peace to your people. And if you do this, then this will probably end up better than anything else." So then Ali goes to Muhammad and he says, "Yeah, Abu Sufyan's willing to become Muslim, but he's a self-important man. The best thing I think we should do is allow him to say, everybody who wants refuge, go to Abu Sufyan's house." So Abu Sufyan agrees, and he and his son Muawiyah convert to Islam. And while there's a little fighting in the south, the Meccan armies quickly surrender and the Muslims move in to the city, and everyone waits to see what's going to happen. To everyone's relief, Muhammad decides to be merciful and basically spares the entire city, but not everyone. According to Sahih al-Bukhari, on the day of the conquest, the Prophet entered Mecca wearing a helmet on his head. When he took it off, a man came to him and said, "Ibn Qatal is clinging to the curtain of the Kaaba." The Prophet said, "Kill him." So Muhammad spared most people and demanded the death of a few people, which varies depending on the source you read. This hadith says it was 4 men and 2 women, but even then, Muhammad didn't kill every single person that he demanded killed. So according to Sunan Abu Dawud, on the day that Mecca was conquered, the Messenger of Allah gave protection to the people except 4 men and 2 women, and named them Ibn al-Sarah was one of them. He then narrated the tradition. He said, Ibn Abu Sarah hid himself with Uthman ibn Affan, again, one of the best guys to know here. When the Messenger of Allah called the people to take their oath of allegiance, he brought him and made him stand before the Messenger of Allah. He said, "Messenger of Allah, receive the oath of allegiance from him." He raised his head and looked at him thrice, denying him every time. After the 3rd time, he received his oath. So then he turned to his companions and said, "Is there not any intelligent man among you who would stand to this man when he saw me desisting from receiving the oath of allegiance and kill him?" They replied, "We do not know, Messenger of Allah, what lies in your heart. Did you not give us a hint with your eye?" So he said, "It is not proper for a prophet to have a treacherous eye." So, to his credit, Muhammad does not follow up and demand this guy's death later. He sticks to his word and allows this man to live. After this, the Muslim army departed from Mecca and went to Taif. Taif was the last remaining stronghold of polytheism in Arabia. There were bits and pieces for a while longer, but Taif was a walled city, and the Muslims besieged it for half of a month. And we can see here that the Muslims were actually using complex battle strategies. Al-Tabari says that they were actually using a testudo to try and break through the city walls. They were unable to break through the city walls. During this time, one of the chiefs of Taif has had his family captured by the Muslims, and Muhammad offered him his family back and 100 camels if he converted to Islam, to which he agreed. The Muslims lifted the siege of Taif, and they tried to make a treaty with the Muslims where they say, okay, we'll keep our religion for 3 more years and then we'll convert to Islam. But rumors come to Muhammad that they're plotting an assassination, and the Muslims move in again. At this time, the residents of Taif can see the writings on the wall, and they all convert to Islam as well. After this, in the year 630, Muhammad has unfinished business with the Byzantines, and he marches an army north all the way to Tabuk in northern Arabia. And no one wants to go because it's hot and they don't really like the idea of fighting the Byzantines again. But this is what Al-Tabari says. This was a season when people were hard pressed. The heat was oppressive and the country was passing through a dry spell. At the time, fruit was ripe and shade was dearly sought. People love to stay where they have shade and fruit trees and find leaving them distasteful. The messenger of God would seldom go out on a military expedition without alluding to a destination and announcing publicly that he meant a place other than he intended. The Tabuk expedition was the exception, in that he explained the particulars of the expedition openly to the people. This was because of the long distance and the difficult season and the enemy's numerical superiority. He wanted the people to be fully prepared, so he ordered them to make ready and informed them that his objective was the Byzantines. They prepared themselves despite their dislike for that approach and what it entailed, as well as their respect for the Byzantines and their fighting ability. They get to Tabuk after this long expedition, but they find the Byzantines are not there, so they appoint a couple of regional governors and go back to Medina. In this year, Muhammad's daughter Kulthum dies as well. During this time, Muhammad has been sending emissaries and letters to all the leaders of the surrounding countries, explaining Islam to them and inviting them to convert. One group that receives a letter from him is a group of Christians in a city called Najran in the south of Arabia. So these Najran Christians send a delegation to Muhammad, and basically they spend 3 days arguing whether or not Jesus is God. So when we and our Muslim friends argue over this issue, this is a tradition that goes back to the very start of Islam itself. After 3 days of not reaching any agreement, the Christians of Najran are invited by Muhammad to basically take part in a curse-off, if you like. Surah Al-Imran says it this way: "Now whoever disputes with you concerning Jesus after full knowledge has come to you, say, 'Come, let us gather our children and your children, our women and your women, ourselves and yourselves, then let us sincerely invoke Allah's curse upon the liars.'" According to Sahih Muslim, Allah's messenger called Ali, Fatima, Hassan, Hussein, and said, "O Allah, they are my family." This is what Shias refer to as the incident of the cloak, marking out these particular people as Muhammad's family. This is from a Sunni source though, so the incident is believed by both sides. The Christians don't agree to this, or they don't show up, or there's various accounts of how this goes down, but it always ends in the Christians not taking the curse. And they go back to Najran and agree to pay the Muslims taxes while getting to remain as Christians. So, to Muhammad's credit, he allows people who disagree with him to continue living in Arabia so long as they pay their taxes. And we can see this as a virtue in Muhammad's life. Now, later there is a hadith that says Muhammad told the Muslims to expel all the Jews and Christians from Arabia. What he meant by that is disputed, but at least at this time he does allow the Christians of Najran to live peacefully, doesn't require them to fight in the military, and accepts tax for them. As well as Jews and Christians, the other Arabs who converted to monotheism, some of them start to claim prophethood as well. So particularly a guy called Musaylima sends a letter to Muhammad saying, "From Musaylima, messenger of God, to Muhammad the messenger of God, salutations to you. I have been given a share with you in this matter. Half the earth belongs to us and half to the Quraysh, but the Quraysh are people who transgress." Then Muhammad sends a response saying, "From Muhammad the messenger of God, to Musaylima, the arch liar. Peace be upon him who follows guidance. Now then, surely the earth belongs to God, who bequeaths it to whom he will amongst his servants. The ultimate issue is to the God-fearing." Musaylima says, "Yeah, I'm a prophet too. We should be friends." Muhammad's message is basically, "No, you're not a prophet. You're the highest of liars, and this will be decided on the battlefield." In 632, Muhammad's only surviving son, Ibrahim, at about 2 years old, gets sick and is on the verge of death, and Sahih al-Bukhari responds it this way: "We entered the house of Abu Saif along with the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, who was the husband of Ibrahim's wet nurse, upon him be peace. The Prophet took hold of Ibrahim, kissed him and smelled him. Then we entered after that as Ibrahim was breathing his last breaths. It made the eyes of the Prophet shed tears. Abdul Rahman ibn Auf said, 'Even you, O Messenger of Allah?' The Prophet said, 'O Ibn Auf, this is mercy.' Then the Prophet wept some more, and he said, 'Verily, the eyes shed tears and the heart is grieved, but we will not say anything except what is pleasing to our Lord. We are saddened by your departure, O Ibrahim.' So this year, Muhammad lost his son. And I think it's important to look on these human tragedies that came to this man and realize that he's not this comic book villain. He's not somebody who is this unfeeling holy man. He's a real man who goes through real things, and it is worth seeing him in this way, whether you're Christian or Muslim or atheist or whatever you are. It's important to see this as a 3D character. In the 11th year after Hijrah, 632 AD, Muhammad leads the Muslims in a final Hajj to Mecca, and then gives a farewell sermon on the mountain of Arafat. He said, "Fear Allah concerning women. Verily you have taken them on the security of Allah, and intercourse with you has been made lawful unto you by words of Allah. You too have right over them, that they should not allow anyone to sit on your bed whom you do not like. But if they do that, you can chastise them, but not severely. Their rights upon you are that you should provide them with food and clothing in a fitting manner. I have left among you the book of Allah, and if you hold fast to it, you would not go astray, and you would be asked about me on the day of resurrection. Now tell me, what would you say?" They, the audience, said, "We will bear witness that you have conveyed the message, discharged the ministry of prophethood, and have given wise, sincere counsel." He, the narrator, said, "He, the holy prophet, then raised his forefinger towards the sky, pointing it at the people, saying, 'O Allah, be witness, O Allah, be witness,' saying it 3 times. Then, returning to Medina, Muhammad started to give in to his sickness. But as he was dying, the crisis of succession was already starting to take shape. Sahih al-Bukhari, it says, "When Allah's messenger was on his deathbed, and there were some men in the house, he said, 'Come near, I'll write for you something after which you will not go astray.' Some of them," his companions, said, "Allah's messenger is seriously ill, and you have the Qur'an. Allah's book is sufficient for us." So the people in the house differed and started disputing. Some of them said, "Give him writing material so he may write for you something after which you will not go astray," while the others said the other way around. So then their talk and differences increased. Allah's apostle said, "Get up," Ibn Abbas used to say. "No doubt it was very unfortunate that Allah's messenger was prevented from writing for them that writing because of the differences and noise." So there's this mysterious thing that Muhammad wanted to say to everybody, but didn't get the chance because everybody kept arguing while he was there. Now, Shias believe that means one thing, Sunnis believe that means a completely different thing. But the roots of the split are already starting to take shape, even now. So 2 accounts of his last words, one according to Aisha, one according to Ali. Aisha reported Allah's Messenger, at the time of breathing his last, was reclining against her chest, and she was leaning over him and listening to him, and he was saying, "O Allah, grant me pardon, show mercy to me, and join me to companions." According to Ali in Sunan Abu Dawud, the last words which the Messenger of Allah spoke were, "Prayer, prayer, fear Allah about those who your right hands possess." 11 years after leaving Mecca and establishing the Islamic State, Muhammad was the overlord of all Arabia. Monotheism was the de facto belief system of Arabia, and the world had been changed forever. And then Muhammad died, leaving behind a void in the Islamic community that would never be filled.